protests and uprisings in Tibet against the government of the People's Republic of China have occurred since 1950, and include the 1959 uprising, the 2008 uprising, and the subsequent self-immolation protests. Over the years, the Tibetan government in exile, the Central Tibetan administration of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, has shifted the goal of its resistance stance from attempting measured cooperation with autonomy, to demanding full independence, to seeking genuine autonomy for all Tibetans living in the three traditional provinces of Tibet within the framework of the People's Republic of China. However, not all exiled Tibetans are content with pursuing a moderate path, and many expressed the frustration in 2008 against the Dalai Lama's wishes by agitating for independence, with the 14th Dalai Lama announcing his retirement from political life just before the April 2011 elections for Prime Minister, who will henceforth be Tibet's political leader. The nature of resistance may be moving into yet another phase, although the three leading candidates currently favor the middle way approach. Background: isolated geography has naturally defined Tibet as a unique entity. However, its governance and political status have been in flux for centuries. The minor kingdoms and tribal states of the region were first united under Songtsen Gampo to form the Tibetan Empire in the 7th century CE. Under the influence of his Chinese bride and first Nepali wife Brikuti, the emperor converted to Buddhism and established it as the religion of Tibet. An influx of Chinese culture, the Indian alphabet, and Buddhist monks followed, combining with the native customs and animistic religion bond to give birth to what has become today's ethnic Tibetan people and Tibetan Buddhism, also known as Lamaism. After the breakup of the Tibetan Empire in the mid-9th century, central rule was largely non-existent over the region for 400 years. But Buddhism survived, and when the Mongols conquered the region, Buddhism was adopted as the official religion of their empire. In 1271, Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty, and Tibet remained a semi-autonomous entity within it. From the second half of the 14th century until the early 17th, Tibet was ruled by competing Buddhist schools. However, it was during this period that the Gelug order was founded in 1409, and the institution of the Dalai Lama was established in 1569, with the priest-patron relationship between the Altan Khan and the third Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lamas are said to be the reincarnates of the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokitesvara. It was when the fifth Dalai Lama Nawang Lobsang Gyatso succeeded in establishing the Ganden Phodrang government and Gelug supremacy in Tibet, with the help of the Gashi Khan of the Koshut Khanate, that the post took on the dual role of political and religious leadership. After Lobsang Gyatso's mortal passing in 1682, which was kept a secret for 15 years, there was a period of anarchy and invasions that eventually led to the establishment of King Protectorate over Tibet in 1720 that would reach its peak in the 1790s in response to attacks by Nepal, be renewed in 1903 when the British invaded, and would last until 1912. Tibet became independent with the demise of the Manchu Qing dynasty and would remain so until 1950. Early resistance. In his essay Hidden Tibet, History of Independence and Occupation, published by the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives at Dharamshala, S. L. Kuzman, quoting the memoirs of Soviet diplomat A. M. Ledovsky, claims that on January 22, 1950, during his negotiations with Joseph Stalin in Moscow, Mao Zedong asked him to provide an aviation regiment because he was preparing to advance towards Tibet. Stalin approved these preparations and provided military support with Soviet pilots and airfield personnel dressed in Chinese clothes. Because this aid was illegal in 1950, The People's Liberation Army of the People's Republic of China entered Tibet, and the U.S. government made contact with the Dalai Lama's brother, Gyalo Thondup, who was living in India, to offer U.S. help, which was rejected. In May 1951, a delegation representing the Dalai Lama, only 15 years old at the time, and led by Napoi Nawang Jigme, traveled to Beijing to be presented with the 17-point agreement for the peaceful liberation of Tibet, which established a PRC suzerainty over Tibet, assuming responsibility for Tibet's external affairs while leaving the domestic governance to the Lhasa government and assuring religious freedoms. The treaty was signed by the Lhasa delegation and the 10th Panchen Lama, who had already switched his loyalty to the PRC after flirting with the Kuomintang and conspiring against the central Tibetan government, which still refused to recognize him as the true Panchen Lama. Later there would be much controversy over the validity of the agreement, stemming from claims it was signed under threat of arms and disagreements about whether the delegates had the authority to sign. But at the time, in Lhasa, the Khutra aristocrats mingled with Chinese officials and even prospered from this association. Mixed parties were thrown throughout the year, and even by the Dalai Lama himself. The burden on farmers and peasants of supplying the troops with food led to shortages and rising prices, coupled with influenza and smallpox outbreaks, weighed heavy on the majority of Tibetans, who were only marginally surviving before. Protests called People's Assemblies began in Lhasa, where organizers sent letters of grievances to the government and posted anti-Chinese slogans in public places. The leaders were promptly arrested and the protests stifled. In early 1952, Thondup returned to Lhasa with an economic reform plan that would include lowering taxes and land reform. With the Dalai Lama in agreement, Thondup went about implementing the reforms only to meet with strong resistance from the wealthy old guard, who labeled him a radical communist. The label sparked the interests of the Chinese, who invited him to Beijing to study, but instead he fled back to India, where he began conspiring with the CIA to form and train a Tibetan insurgency. Again, the U.S. tried to convince the Dalai Lama to do the same with an offer of full aid and assistance, but he refused. The Dalai Lama saw the need to modernize Tibet and was open to Marxism. Indeed, on the Tibetan leader's journey home from his year in China, Khampa and Amdao clan leaders informed his chief of staff of the plans to rebel against the Chinese in retribution for land confiscation and attacks on monasteries. But all was relatively quiet in Lhasa, and in April 1956 he received a Chinese delegation to inaugurate the Preparatory Committee for the Autonomous Region of Tibet, a 51-man committee composed mostly of Tibetans. Meanwhile, open rebellion began with the massacre of a communist garrison in Kham, which left an estimated 800 Chinese dead, sparking airstrikes that killed more Tibetans. In addition, the CIA met with the Dalai Lama's two brothers Thut Jigme Norbu and Gyalo Thondup in India and offered to train a pilot group of 6 Khampas in guerrilla warfare and radio communications in Saipan. They were smuggled out of Tibet and would later be parachuted back in to train others and to report back to the CIA on the insurgency's progress and needs. According to the Dalai Lama, his visit to India in November 1956, during which he met with Tibetan freedom fighters, which included 2 of his elder brothers, spoiled good relations with China. The exiles encouraged him to stay and join the fight for independence, but Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru warned him that India could not offer support Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, who was also in Delhi, assured him of Mao's decision to postpone for 6 years further reforms in Tibet. Both Nehru and Enlai counseled the Lama to return to Lhasa. Although the Chinese let up on reforms, they continued military operations in the areas in rebellion, causing thousands of refugees to gather around Lhasa. In July 1957, the Dalai Lama hosted a large ceremony in the Potala Palace, during which he accepted the Golden Throne and petition from representatives of the Chushi Gangdruk movement, and in return gave them a blessing touch on the foreheads, and issued them with a talisman. They would soon become a 5,000-man strong Defenders of the Faith volunteer army under the leadership of Gompo Tashi Andrug Sang that would struggle against the Chinese for years. However, in September 1957, when the first 2 CIA trainees dropped into Tibet to deliver a message from the CIA offering support to the Tibetan leader, it was refused. The second drop of 4 men was disastrous. Only one managed to escape alive. Meanwhile, by 1958, Gompo's army was doing quite well, taking control of large portions of central Tibet. On March 10, 1959, a huge crowd surrounded the Summer Palace in response to a rumor that the Chinese Communists were planning to arrest the Dalai Lama at a cultural performance in the People's Liberation Army camp. The people were determined not to allow the Dalai Lama to leave Norbilinka Palace. A mob riot ensued that at first was directed at Tibetan officials perceived not to be adequately protecting the Dalai Lama, but quickly evolved into a full-scale anti-Chinese rebellion. PLA General Tan considered the Dalai Lama to be in danger and offered him refuge if he could just make it to the Chinese camp. He declined the offer. A week into the fighting, the general ordered 2 mortar rounds shot toward the palace. At that point, the Dalai Lama decided the time had come to slip out over the mountains with a very small party. Arriving a few days later at the Indian border, he was granted asylum by the Nehru government with the stipulation that he would not engage in politics on Indian soil. Meanwhile, Enlai dissolved the Tibetan government and appointed the preparatory committee for the founding of the Tibet Autonomous Region to take its place. 1959 Tibetan Uprising. Once in exile, the Dalai Lama's discourse changed from cooperative autonomy to independence. He cited the 17-point agreement as proof of Tibet's claim to sovereignty, while at the same time he declared it void because the Chinese had violated it and because, he claimed, it had been signed under duress. He also made clear that he was in favor of economic, social and political reforms, but that the Chinese had not acted in good faith. He closed his first press conference in India in April 1959 by subtly establishing the government in exile by declaring, "Wherever I am accompanied by my government, the Tibetan people will recognize such as the government of Tibet." The UN General Assembly responded by passing 3 resolutions in the first half of the decade calling for respect for the fundamental human rights of the Tibetan people and for their distinctive cultural and religious life, and recognizing the right of the Tibetan people to self-determination. The U.S. responded differently. Already in July 1958, airdrops of arms to the Chushi Gandruk had begun. The CIA had relocated Tibetan guerrilla trainees to Camp Hale in Colorado, USA, and parachute dispatch officers had been recruited from among the Montana U.S. Forest Service smoke jumpers. But according to Thundrop, the Dalai Lama did not know about CIA involvement until he reached India. As he was announcing his whereabouts, the Khampa rebels were met by massive Chinese forces and were nearly obliterated. While they spent several months regrouping, the U.S. failed to form a coalition of nations willing to recognize the Tibetan government in exile or even to find countries who would host the Dalai Lama on a tour to explain his cause. In autumn, the CIA parachuted 4 groups of Camp Hale trainees inside Tibet. The first was met by Chinese and the men fled for their lives. 2 groups arrived safely and even facilitated successful arms drops, but the Chinese caught on, and within a month all but a few of the team members and thousands of Kampa families were massacred. The CIA guerrilla training failed to take into account that the Kampa warriors traveled with family and livestock in tow. The 4th group had about the same luck. They arrived, received arms drops, were joined by 2 more teams. But in February 1960 the Chinese killed them along with another 4,000 rebel fighters and the parties. One last group was dropped in 1961, but all but one were killed only 3 months after landing. The survivor was captured and, as he says, tortured until he told the entire story of Colorado. He was released from prison in 1979, at the proposal of Thundop and Gompo Tashi. In early 1960, a Tibetan guerrilla base was established in Mustang, Nepal, where some 2,000 mostly ethnic Kampa amassed in such a disorderly fashion that the first year was a challenge for survival, given that the U.S. could not get food supplies to them due to a suspension of overflights stemming from the U-2 incident. By spring 1961, Mustang guerrilla units had begun raids along a 250-mile stretch inside Tibet. In addition, some 12,000 Tibetans eventually joined the Special Frontier Force that manned the Sino-Indian border. But as the years passed without any bases established inside Tibet, U.S. enthusiasm over the Mustang fighters dwindled, and already sparse and insufficient arms drops ceased in 1965, leaving an aging and barely armed guerrilla force in dire straits. The 25 small teams of Colorado-trained Tibetans who were sent into Tibet from 1964 to 1967 on fact-finding missions had no better luck. Only 2 were able to operate in country for more than 2 months, finding no support from compatriots. Meanwhile, the CIA provided the government in exile money to open offices in Geneva and New York, to arrange for resettlement of Tibetan orphans in Switzerland, and to educate a few dozen Tibetans at Cornell University. By the time Nixon came to the White House, the CIA had already informed Thundrop that they were terminating support. Years later, he would have this to say about the affair. According to author and scholar Carol McGranahan of the University of Colorado, today the history of the Tibetan resistance is purposefully downplayed, uncelebrated, and even ignored by the Tibetan government in exile, as it does not fit well into the global image it wishes to project and the current official position of seeking a peaceful coexistence with China. Middle way approach. According to the Office of the Dalai Lama, the essence of the middle way approach seeks coexistence based on equality and mutual cooperation. It is a non-partisan and moderate position that safeguards the vital interests of all concerned parties. For Tibetans, the protection and preservation of the culture, religion and national identity; for the Chinese, the security and territorial integrity of the motherland; and for neighbors and other third parties, peaceful borders and international relations. The seeds of the middle way approach were sown in the early 1970s in a series of internal government and external consultations. The Dalai Lama was encouraged in 1979 when Deng Xiaoping told his brother Gyalo Thondup that, except independence, all other issues can be resolved through negotiations. The Dalai Lama agreed to pursue negotiations for a mutually beneficial and peaceful resolution rather than fighting to restore independence. He sent 3 fact-finding missions into Tibet and wrote Deng Xiaoping a long personal letter before his representatives traveled to Beijing in 1982 to open negotiations. However, they reported that the Chinese counterparts were not interested in discussing the situation in Tibet, only the personal status and future of the 14th Dalai Lama. Nevertheless, during the 1980s, the Dalai Lama would send 6 delegations to China. In 1987, before the U.S. Congressional Human Rights Caucus, the Dalai Lama unveiled the 5-point peace plan as a first step towards a lasting solution: transformation of the whole of Tibet into a zone of peace, abandonment of China's population transfer policy which threatens the very existence of the Tibetans as a people, respect for the Tibetan people's fundamental human rights and democratic freedoms, restoration and protection of Tibet's natural environment, and the abandonment of China's use of Tibet for the production of nuclear weapons and dumping of nuclear waste, commencement of earnest negotiations on the future status of Tibet and of relations between the Tibetan and Chinese peoples. The next year, the Dalai Lama addressed the European Parliament and offered what was later called the Strasbourg Proposal 1988, which elaborated on the middle way approach and a vision of reconciliation, resembling what some historians say was a suzerainty relationship between China and Tibet. The proposal basically calls for the establishment of a democratic Tibet with complete sovereignty over its domestic affairs and non-political, foreign affairs, with China retaining its responsibility for Tibet's foreign policy and maintaining its military presence temporarily. The periodic meetings between the Central Tibetan administration's envoys and the Chinese government were fell like one hand clapping, and so the CTA suspended them in 1994. They resumed at the pace of 1 per year between 2002 and 2008. In 2008, at the 8th round of talks, CTA envoys presented a document called Memorandum on Genuine Autonomy for the Tibetan People and a note in response to Chinese government's statement asking what degree of autonomy is being sought by Tibetans. The memorandum states that, in order for the Tibetan nationality to develop and flourish with its distinct identity, culture and spiritual tradition through the exercise of self-government on the above-mentioned 11 basic Tibetan needs, the entire community, comprising all the areas currently designated by the PRC as Tibetan Autonomous Areas, should be under a single administrative entity. It further mentions that bringing all the Tibetans currently living in designated Tibetan Autonomous Areas within a single autonomous administrative unit is entirely in accordance with the constitutional principle contained in Article 4, also reflected in the Law on Regional National Autonomy (LRNA), that regional autonomy is practiced in areas where people of minority nationalities live in concentrated communities. According to Central Tibetan administration, the middle way approach enjoys widespread support from the international community. In 2008, a group of 29 Chinese dissidents urged Beijing to open direct dialogue with Tibet's exiled spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama. In June 2012, the European Parliament in Strasbourg passed a resolution commending the new CTA leadership for its commitment to resolve the issue of Tibet through middle way approach. U.S. President Barack Obama, after meeting with Dalai Lama on the 21st of February 2014, issued a statement applauding the Dalai Lama's commitment to non-violence and dialogue with China and his pursuit of middle way approach. On the 5th of June 2014, Central Tibetan administration launched an international awareness campaign campaign on the Middle Way approach. According to CTA, the campaign was to counter Chinese government's deliberate attempts to spread misinformation on the Middle Way approach. During the campaign, CTA created a series of documents, website, documentary film and social media handles. Criticism: the Middle Way approach has been criticized by Elliot Sperling as a part of larger self-delusion of the CTA. The Tibetan Review points out how the Kashag effectively edits out even crystal-clear voices for independence. 2008 Uprisings. Sporadic and isolated outbursts by Tibetans against the Chinese continued, especially during the unrest between September 1987 until March 1989 in the Tibetan areas of the PRC. But it wasn't until 2008 that a large-scale and coordinated uprising erupted, coinciding with international protests accompanying the Olympics torch relay that would end in Beijing, where the 2008 Summer Olympics were held. What originally began as an annual observance of Tibetan Uprising Day turned into street protests by large numbers of monks from various monasteries. For several days, crowd control and arrests escalated the tensions, eventually setting off a riot by thousands of Tibetans in the remote section of Lhasa on March 14, 2008. When the police fled the scene, rioters looted and burned more than 1,200 Chinese shops, offices, and residences and set fire to nearly 100 vehicles. In the end, an estimated 22 were dead and 325 injured, mostly Han. Total damage was estimated at $40 million USD. Eventually the paramilitary People's Armed Police were sent in and 50 to 100 Tibetan rioters were killed before things quieted down. Meanwhile, in the Gansu province, a demonstration by 400 monks were met with force that ignited riots by more than 5,000 Tibetans, who again burned down the establishments of local Han and Hui people before security forces arrived. The Tibetan chairman of the Thai government, Jampa Phuntsok, who was in Beijing at the time, told the foreign press that security personnel in Lhasa had shown great restraint and did not use lethal force. However, it was the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party who was dispatched to Tibet to deal with the situation, and the Tibetan officials remained in other provinces. Eventually 90 locations erupted in protests. Their common slogans and Tibetan flags indicated desires for independence or autonomy. Simultaneously, in India, a coalition of Tibetan exile organizations, Tibetan Youth Congress, Tibetan Women's Association, Tibetan Political Prisoners Movement, Students for a Free Tibet, and National Democratic Party of Tibet, calling itself the Tibetan People's Uprising Movement, struck out on a return march to Tibet on March 10. Carrying Tibetan flags and calling for independence. They planned to reach Tibet on foot just in time for the opening of the Olympic Games. Both India and Nepal reminded the Dalai Lama that the Tibetans' welcome in the area was predicated on the agreement of no anti-China political maneuvers from the territories. The Dharamshala government met with the marchers. When it was clear that the marchers would continue the trek, they were arrested by state authorities in the northern Indian state of Uttarakhand on March 28. On March 24, 2008, the Olympic torch relay began its 137,000 kilometers route. Tibetan exiles and supporters in Paris, London, San Francisco, New Delhi, Islamabad, and Jakarta, Seoul, etc. used the event to stage protests. In some places they were met by local Chinese and other counter-protesters. The fiasco caused the International Olympics Committee to ban international torch relay in the future. The Chinese government blamed the Dalai clique for the uprising, the march and the Olympic protests, and called TYC a terrorist organization prepared to initiate guerrilla warfare once across the border. The The PRC published articles denouncing the various historical plots and activities of the Tibetan exiles as well as U.S. funding to Tibetan activists. Through the National Endowment for Democracy, the Dalai Lama denied that his government had anything to do with the Olympic protests and said that he did not advocate a boycott of the Games. He called on demonstrators to refrain from any violence, and gave interviews clarifying that his goals were not currently to seek independence from China. The Dalai Lama threatened to resign over TPUM disobedience to the official policy of non-violence and genuine Tibetan autonomy. His ultimately using Indian state authority to stop the march caused a rift between him and some of his younger followers. In the end, international pressure finally led PRC representatives to renew unofficial talks with their Dharamshala counterparts.